Welcome to a TUSD Robotics production, how to use OnShape to CAD VEX robots. Today's lesson is all about constraints, and by the end of the lesson, your goal is to make a wheel that rotates on an axle through the holes of both the bearing flat and the aluminum bar as shown in this image. All right, let's get started. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the OnShape iPad app to do our first lesson on constraints. Now, in your home menu, you will see that you have everything you've ever created or opened in that My OnShape. But in the Shared With Me, you will find the document that I've shared with you that has some part files already inserted, as well as an assembly file that I made for you to explore. Now, you will see that this is a part studio. This is how we create a part, and we're actually not going to do that because I've already imported the parts for you. This is an assembly file, and if you look at the bottom tab right here, you will see that this is an assembly file where parts are put together. Now, over along the left side, you can see each part individually, and when I tap on it, it highlights. And if I tap on two, it'll highlight two parts. So watch as I highlight this. That's the drive shaft or axle. Now I tap on the next one. That is the outer part of the wheel. The next one is the inner part of the wheel. This one is the shaft collar. Let me zoom in so you can see it a little better. That's on the end of that axle. And so as I scroll through and highlight each one, I have to tap it and then tap it again to deselect. And then sometimes you can actually select two at a time. So I can highlight one and two and see both parts are highlighted together, the screw and the nut. Now below the parts, you will see the mates. Now mates are the way that parts are constrained together, which means basically glued together or how they interact with one another. So as I tap on the mates, you can see which parts are constrained together. Each one has a different name, and I'm going to go through those as we build our lesson one. But you can see the two parts that are constrained together in each of these mates along the left side menu. So one thing I want to point out is this little caret arrow in the bottom left corner. This can expand your files along the bottom of your screen so that you can see a preview of the different assembly or part files. And here they've loaded right here. So you can see we have an aluminum bar, a bearing flat, a screw, a nut. I'm going to go through these as we build our assembly. Now to make an assembly, you're going to create a new assembly file that's blank, and you're going to try and create what I made in this assembly file that I shared with you. Now all of the part files have already been imported for you, and I shared the document, so you don't need to import them, they're already here, and you don't need to create them because I imported them. However, you will insert these part files into an assembly file to make what you see right here. Now this shared document that I've shared with you is view only, meaning that you can't edit anything. So you're going to need to make a copy. So if you tap the little I in the far right, you will see that there is an option for copy. Now that you've made a copy, you're going to name it. You can go ahead and leave it with the suggested name with copy, or you can name it something specific for your purposes. And then you will see that this is an editable copy that you can create a new assembly file. So to do this, you're going to tap that blue caret arrow in the bottom left corner and then tap the plus sign. And that will bring up this menu where you can tap Create Assembly. Okay, so now you have a blank assembly that you can start inserting the different part files into and putting them together. So to do this, you're going to tap the Insert icon in the top left corner, and then a menu will appear, and I'm going to select which part I want, and the first one's going to be this aluminum C channel. And then I tap the check to accept. Okay, so now we're going to insert the second part, which is the bearing flat. So we'll go back to the Insert menu up at the top left, tap on the Insert icon, and then we will select the bearing flat. And then the check mark to accept, and you'll see the bearing flat is added to the workspace. Now I'm going to move that bearing flat over a little bit, and you can see that we have two different parts here that we want to basically glue together, and we're going to use what's called the fastener mate. There are many different types of constraints found in this features menu up at the top left. So when I tap on the features menu, you will see that we're going to select the fastener mate. The fastener mate basically glues two pieces together so that they may not rotate on an axis. They're stuck together. So when you use the constraints or the different types of mates, you will need to use the selection tool when you're on an iPad. In order to do this, you hold your finger down on the white space and then you drag your finger over to the point on the part that you're trying to select. Let me share a part of the tutorial number 1 for the iPad that better explains how to use the selection tool that you're seeing on the screen right now.
Another important gesture for using OnShape is the precision selector. To select things precisely, you'll want to tap and hold with a single finger. After holding for a moment, you'll see the precision selector appear. While holding your finger down, simply move over the entity that you're trying to select and let go. The precision selector is used throughout OnShape anytime precision selection is needed. One last important gesture when using OnShape Mobile is the double tap. Double tapping the screen with a single finger will deselect any entities that are selected.
Don't forget that when too many things get selected, just double tap the white space on your screen with a single finger and it will deselect everything. You're going to need this all the time when using the iPad. Okay, so here we're going to try this again. We're going to the constraints menu and I select the fastener mate. Then I use my selection tool and notice that there's a variety of points I can choose. I'm looking for the top portion of that center circle. Now notice when I select a point, in the properties box for the fastened one mate, it says one entity selected. Now one thing I found difficult to do on the iPad when selecting 2 points to mate together is to rotate once that properties box is open. So you'll see what I'm doing here is I'm trying to rotate that bearing flat so that the back side is showing as well as the front side of the aluminum bar, which is what I want to fasten it to. So I'm really trying to use those arrows and those little dots at the end of the arrows. That's how you rotate the parts. It takes a little bit of practice to get used to this, but I'm trying to rotate that bearing flat so that the back side is visible as well as the front side of the aluminum bar, because that's what I'm trying to fasten together. So notice it's taking me some time to figure out how to do this, but I'm rotating that bearing flat around so that I can fasten the 2 points together. So now that I can see the 2 points, I'm going to open that features menu again and click on Fasten Mate. Then I'm going to use my selection tool to select that top side of that circle. Notice there's a bottom and top of the circle. I selected the top of the circle. Now I'm going to the aluminum bar and I'm going to select the circle inside the middle of one of those holes in the aluminum bar. Now look at the fastener mate property box. You can see that 2 entities are selected, and there are a couple settings that I like to play with to make sure I have the right rotation and right axes that I've picked. So just click that arrow and that circle at the bottom of the properties box and it will kind of show you the different configurations for those 2 points you've selected. All right, once you think it's right, tap the check mark to accept, and it looks like our bearing flat is now fastened to the aluminum bar. Okay, now it's time to insert our next part. You're going to go up to the Insert menu, and then you're going to select a screw. We're going to tap the screw and then tap the check mark at the top to accept, and notice that a screw has been placed in our workspace. It's actually on the aluminum bar. So I'm going to move it off of the aluminum bar so I can see it. And now I'm going to go up to the Features menu to choose the Fastener Mate again. And this time I'm going to use the back side of the head of the screw. So I use the selection tool. And notice once it's highlighted, or there's several selection points, you can tell by those little white dots. Once I found the white dot I want to tap on that. So I'm selecting that center point of the top head of the screw. Now, I think I can select the center part of the hole of the bearing flat without rotating. If you aren't able to, you're going to have to close out this mate and then redo it. And I have to do that many times to learn this program. So I select the center point of that right hole and I use my little adjustments, the arrow and the circle in the properties menu, and I can see that I want the screw facing that way and I hit accept. Now, one thing that I had to learn is that if it doesn't say in your properties menu that you've selected an entity, then you need to make sure that you do that. So you need to tap on that little white dot to select the entity. Let's try this again. I inserted another screw, and now I'm going to use that fastener mate. So once again, I tap on the features icon and then the fastener mate. And now my properties window opens, so I need to select my first entity. I'm going to use the back of the head of the screw, that center point. So I'm going to use my selection tool, come over, and then tap that little white dot. Notice it doesn't say any entities are selected yet. I got to make sure I can get it to do that. So I'm going to tap that little white dot in the center. Sometimes zooming in helps. And notice once I select it and I tap on that white dot, it looks a little bit different. And in the properties window, it says one entity selected. Okay, now I'm going to go over to that bearing flat. I want to insert this screw on the far left corner of that bearing flat. I'm going to zoom in and notice I can see the entire hole that's going through, but I'm going to select that top portion. I'm going to tap on that white dot to select that top portion of that hole. The trick is the little white dot, and it took me a while to figure this one out. So here we go, right there in the white dot. Notice it says 2 entities selected. I'm going to make my little adjustments with the arrow, and this is the way I want the screw to point. So I hit the check mark accept. All right, we've got 2 screws going through the bearing flats on either side, which is the way we want it. Now we're going to insert 2 new parts, and they're going to be the nuts that go on the back side of these screws. Okay, so we're going to go to our insert menu, and then we're going to select what's called a nylock nut to go into the workspace. A nylock nut is a special type of nut that has nylon inserted on one side. The back side is metal, and that's what we're going to attach or fasten to the other piece of metal. But this inner part right here is nylon, so that when a screw enters that nylon area, it locks it in place. They're actually pretty hard to take off of a robot, so I don't suggest building your first robot with these, but we're building a virtual robot so we can easily take them off. Okay, so now I need to fasten this nylock to the screw, and I actually am going to need to rotate it so that I can see the back side of the nylock, this metal side right here, as well as the back side of this screw. So can't see them both right now. So on an iPad, since this is hard to do, I'm going to rotate that nut using those circle features. And I'm trying to get it so I can see the back side of this nylock nut right there, as well as the side of the screw that I'm trying to fasten it to. So this is a pretty good place. So I'm going to use the features menu to open the fastener mate, and I'm going to select that center point on the back of the nylock nut. So look for that white dot and hit select. Check your properties window. It says 1 entity selected. So now I'm going to choose my second point. I'm going to use the center point of the screw. Now notice that it says 2 entities selected, and that's a good thing. But my nylock is not actually going the way I want it to. So there's a couple ways to adjust this. One, I should have chosen the center point on the nylon side to then go flush with the backside end of the screw. The other way is to change an offset. So there's an offset setting in the properties menu, and I can adjust any part along the X, Y, or Z axis. And you just kind of use the calculator to see which amount you would like to adjust the axes. And so on this one, I adjusted the X axis to make that nylock nut go flush with the metal bar. But really, I could have done a different selection order and fixed this from the very start. So I'm going to insert another nylock nut. Let's try this again. So I'm going to rotate and move that nylock so that I can get it so I can see the side of the nylock nut that I want to select. And honestly, you should be choosing the center top hole of the nylon side this time instead of the back side, which it looks like I'm probably going to try here again. Then I won't have to use that offset. So here I'm rotating to the side that I thought I was going to use, but I would actually turn it over and use the nylock side. And then I get my fastener mate open in the features window. I need to move this whole thing over so I can use my selection tool. And so notice I'm choosing here's the top hole. You should either use the other side of the nylock nut or just go down to the bottom of that hole. And here again, I'm going to do the same thing where I select the center point of the screw, and it's going to do the same thing once again. It's going to put it on backwards, but really you'll get used to doing this. I'm going to use the offset again in the Z to offset this about -0.2 inches. You can see it moves it the wrong direction. I'm going to open up that offset again, and I'm going to change it to a +0.2. And then it puts it exactly where I want. You can avoid the whole offset just by selecting the other side of the hole of the nylock nut. It'll be a whole lot easier to do it that way. But it looks like now we have 2 screws with 2 nuts holding that bearing flat in place. Everything's fastened together and it's looking good. Okay, now it's time to insert our next part. We're going to go back to that insert menu, and we're going to insert the drive shaft, or what's also called an axle. And we're going to place that in our workspace by tapping the check mark for accept. And now we have this axle, and the axle is going to go through the center hole of that bearing flat. However, we're not going to fasten it because we want it actually to revolve and move and turn when the wheel turns. So this time we're going to go back to the features menu, and we're not going to choose the fastener mate. This time we're going to select the revolute mate. It's right to the right of the fastener mate. Okay, so now I'm going to select the center point of the axle or the shaft. Notice it says one entity selected. I come over to the center point hole of my bearing flat and I select it. Now it looks like the bearing flat moved, but it was just temporary. So once I hit that check mark, accept, you can see that the axle is going through the center hole of the bearing flat. So everything looks right, except for I want that axle to be offset. So I'm going to reopen that properties window by simply just tapping on the 3 dots next to that type of mate in the left menu, and then I can start working on the offsets. Now notice in the revolute mate, there's only one axis that we can offset because we're rotating on the x-axis. So I'm going to offset 2 inches on that x-axis, and that looks like it's a little too long. So I'm going to adjust that to that's 1 inch. It still looks a little bit long. So I'm going to adjust it to 0.5, and that looks perfect to add what we're going to call a shaft collar to the end. So your x-axis should be offset at 0.5 inches. That's enough to put a shaft collar on the end and a wheel on the other side. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the insert menu, and it's time to insert the shaft collar that I was just talking about. So we're going to tap that check mark to accept, and the shaft collar is added to our workspace. Now there's a little tiny hole in that shaft collar. Normally a little screw goes in there that tightens down on the shaft or the axle. We're going to leave that out. It's a bit too complicated for our virtual robots. Okay, so I'm going to try to rotate this shaft collar so I can see the hole in the center as well as the center point on the axle at the same time, since once we open that properties window, we're not able to make these adjustments on the iPad. So here we go. I make my rotation, a little bit more there, perfect. I'm going to go to the features menu, and we're going to use the fastener mate again. Select the fastener mate, and then I'm going to look for the center point of that shaft collar hole and hit select, or that little white dot to select the entity. Now I'm going to go over to the axle, and again also hit the center point of the axle or the shaft. I make my little adjustments with the arrow and the rotate in the bottom left corner of my properties window. And if you need to offset it, you can. Usually our shaft collars go flush up against the bearing flat. So I'm going to actually reopen that fastener property window. I'm going to go to the offset, and I'm going to kind of play around with which axis that is. I think it's the X because that's what the axle's on. And I just offset it a tiny bit so that it goes closer to the bearing flat. And that is what it looks like when you build a real robot. Okay, it's time to put on the wheel. So you're going to go back to the insert menu, and you're going to select the 4-inch wheel, and you're going to hit the check mark to accept. I'm going to move this wheel off of the other parts of the assembly here, and notice that the wheel comes in 2 parts. So we actually have to fasten the wheel together in order to make it one piece. So we're going to start by opening the features menu to fasten this inner circle right here on the rubber part of the wheel to a similar circle on the inner part of the wheel. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You'll see I'll use my selection tool. This line right here looks right. So I'm going to tap that white dot to select the second entity and check mark to accept. So now our wheel is in one piece. Okay, so now when I select the square hole in the center of the wheel, it will move both parts onto the axle. Now I found when I was trying to mate this wheel onto the axle that the center points didn't work the way I thought they would. So we're actually going to use a line in the middle of this square hole. Since it's a square and it goes all the way through the wheel, there's a line on the edge of that square hole that we're going to use to select. And so here I'm going to use my selection tool, and there we go. I see the line. I'm going to tap that white dot to select it. And now I'm going to go to my axle, and I have found that you can go to the 3D cube in the right corner and select a different view. So if you want to rotate it while that property window is open, this is the way you can do it. You can't use your two fingers to do it, but you can use the menu on the 3D cube. So I rotate it around so that I can find the exact line on the axle that I want to use. I actually use the dimetric view and then zoomed in so I could use that line on the edge of the axle, and I'm going to use that center point because that's where I want the wheel to go. And when I hit accept, the wheel perfectly goes onto that line because the two lines I selected glue together where it fits perfect. Now, you might have to make some adjustments with offsets or learn to figure out which lines are the perfect lines to go together. But you will eventually figure this out as you play and practice with OnShape more. So the only thing I need to do is offset this wheel so that it's closer to the aluminum bar. And I'm actually going to reopen my properties window, and I'm going to first adjust this x-axis, and I realize that's not the right axis. So I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to try the z-axis instead. The z-axis, I find, will move that wheel up or down on the axle. And so I start with 2, and it's going the wrong way, so I know I need a negative sign to make it go the other way. And a 2 is too far, so I'm going to try negative, let's delete that, -1 inch. And let's see what that looks like. And it's exactly where I want it. So I offset the z by -1, and this is my final product. All right, we have reached the end of the lesson. The one thing that you can test on an iPad for the Revolute Mate is I can select that axle and rotate it, and notice that even though nothing moves, I can still move the axle, which then rotates the wheel. So this is how I could test that my assembly was made the way it was intended to. All right, that's it. Congratulations, you did it. That's the end of the constraints lesson for VEX using an iPad.